Morning, everyone. Thank you for your presence. I'm joined, of course, by our distinguished Vice Chair, Catherine Clark. The best thing that can be said about the president's speech is that it's over. Donald Trump has left the building, and now we can get back to doing the business of fighting for the people. House Democrats have been very clear that we have an agenda that's focused on working families, middle-class folks, senior citizens, the poor, the sick, the afflicted, and veterans. House Democrats have been very clear that we're focused on lowering health care costs, increasing pay for everyday Americans through a real infrastructure plan, and cleaning up corruption and the mess that the other side of the aisle has created. It appears tangentially, based on Donald Trump's speech, that he agrees with parts of the House Democratic agenda, particularly as it relates to lowering health care costs and a real, meaningful, bipartisan infrastructure plan. House Democrats believe that we should lower health care costs, beginning with a focus on driving down the high cost of life-saving prescription drugs. House Democrats want to give Medicare the ability to use its bulk price purchasing power to negotiate lower drug prices on behalf of the American people. House Democrats have a $1 trillion infrastructure plan that we believe will fix our crumbling bridges, roads, tunnels, airports, and mass transportation system, and also create 16 million good-paying jobs. House Democrats are going to continue our focus on kitchen table pocketbook issues. The president briefly talked the talk. Now it's time for us to walk the walk together. House Democrats have an ambitious agenda on lowering health care costs and on a real infrastructure plan, and we look forward to working on these issues in a bipartisan fashion. Let me now yield to our distinguished Vice Chair, Catherine Clark.
Thank you, Hakeem, and thank you all for being here. The president certainly covered a lot of ground last night. He told a story of shared ideals and unity, but in reality, he's distorted the impact of his own policies and actions and advocated for policies that are rooted in the past and omitted issues that Americans have ardently called for Washington to address. He proclaimed support for an economy that works for everyone, but failed to mention the $2 trillion debt caused by his tax bill that favors corporations and wealthy people over working Americans. He talked about working families in this country, but failed to mention those workers are facing stagnant wages, increasing costs of childcare, and housing. He called for protecting those with pre-existing conditions, but I did not hear him call to end the lawsuits attacking the ACA and would upend those protections for pre-existing conditions and other protections for families in that bill. He trumpeted our continued reliance on oil and coal, but never mentioned climate change or the real threat to national security that it poses. He spoke of the importance of mothers having precious little time with their children, and I too would like to pass a family paid leave policy, but he never mentioned separating families at the border. I hope to work with him on eradicating AIDS and HIV, but this is in total contrast to the policies that he has put forth that threaten the LGBTQ community and his assault on Title X funding that in 2016 alone would provide more than 4 million people with testing, including HIV. The president spoke about the tragedy in Pittsburgh. He brought 2 survivors of that incredible tragic events that unfolded at the Tree of Life Synagogue. But He never talked about gun violence in this country and what we are going to do about it. My guest at the State of the Union was a student activist named Angie. She was so devastated after Parkland that she joined a national walkout and brought 900 students with her. That was just missing from the State of the Union and the speech last night. Democrats are moving forward on our For the People agenda, and we will be holding our first hearing on gun violence today, the first one in 8 years. Our message to the president and the American people is clear. Our policies will strengthen all communities and lift up every American, and that is what you should expect from your government and this Congress. So thank you, and we will open it up to questions.
Well, I mean, it seemed like a little bit of a mixed message from the president last night, and the big thing on the table now, I think, is still the funding the government and keeping everything moving. Do you have more or less confidence that that process will go through and that the president will accept it? And if not, are you prepared for him to declare an emergency at the border?
Well, there's a bipartisan process that's underway that we believe is working well. House Democrats are prepared to support 21st century border security. We've reiterated that and put a robust proposal on the table. We're willing to invest in increased infrastructure, particularly along our legal ports of entry, which, by the way, are the primary means by which contraband and narcotics come into the United States of America. We're willing to invest in additional personnel, particularly as it relates to customs agents, which are understaffed right now, as well as immigration judges, which the administration has agreed to support. We're also willing, of course, to invest in additional technology, such as sensors, drones, satellites, scanners, and the things that the experts have said will increase border security. As long as the president is willing to accept evidence-based proposals, then I think we can arrive at a bipartisan agreement. If the president is only interested in funding a reckless political promise with respect to a medieval border wall that will be ineffective in improving our security, then we're going to have an issue. Well, based on the information that has been provided to us by Chairwoman Lowy, the Democrats and the Republicans, the House and the Senate, are working closely together. I remain cautiously optimistic, but I'm not going to get ahead of the process that they've set forth. But hopefully the lesson has been learned that shutting down the government is not a legitimate negotiating tactic. Catherine?
Yeah, I think part of the concern comes from, not from the process that we're undergoing in Congress, which I think is we are coming together in a bipartisan way to look at what really can improve national security. But when you have the president talking about the Democratic proposals in one part of his speech, you know, strengthening our ports, making sure we have more personnel, using technology, and then he veers off in misinformation about El Paso, that it was one of the most dangerous cities until they built a wall. That is simply not accurate information. But if the president remains committed to data-driven, effective border security measures, I think we will have an agreement. And we're certainly hopeful that the $11 billion hit to our economy from this shutdown is a lesson and an occurrence that this president does not want to repeat.
Go across the second row. Thanks. Well, the House is a separate and co-equal branch of government. We have an Article 1 responsibility to serve as a check and balance on an out-of-control executive branch. We take that Article 1 constitutional responsibility seriously. We will not be bullied by the President of the United States. The days of the House functioning as a wholly owned subsidiary of the Trump administration are over. That ended on January 3rd. That said, we're not going to overreach. We're not going to over-investigate. We're not going to over-politicize our constitutional responsibilities. The House is going to proceed with restraint, with regular order, and that's why hearings will take place, including the one on exploring taxes related to the president and the vice president before any action is taken. Our major priority is lowering healthcare costs, leading with reducing the high price of prescription drugs, a real infrastructure plan, and cleaning up corruption.
Mr. Jeffries, you said last week that fencing, if done appropriately, could be part of the solution on the border. But then when the conference committee proposal came out from Democrats, it had zero money for physical barriers of any kind. So did you misspeak?
We have supported enhanced fencing where appropriate in the past. I think that we expect that if the evidence supports the notion for enhanced fencing moving forward, that you will find some bipartisan consensus in that regard.
This is a related question, but do you think that that enhanced fencing can only be where fencing already exists, or could that be in new areas of the border that don't currently have fencing?
It's not appropriate for me to get out ahead of what the particulars are in terms of the negotiation, because that's a process that has been put in place and we've all agreed to respect it. I think it goes without saying that some sort of physical barrier or medieval border wall from sea to shining sea is outrageous, ridiculous, and is not evidence-based. What we do know about the southwest border is that there are parts that are mountainous terrain and or enveloped by bodies of water, particularly around the Rio Grande Valley. There are parts of the border that are privately owned and would require eminent domain that neither side seems to support at this moment. There are also parts of the border that are sacred Native American land, and it will be wholly inappropriate and perhaps a violation of their sovereignty to try to impose some sort of medieval border wall to fulfill a campaign applause line. Those are just facts. And what we've said is that our approach to border security in totality should be evidence-based.
What did you make of the president's comments last night when he said the country is not going to become a socialist country? He appeared to be taking shots at a couple of members who thought this were Democrats, but also a lot of Democrats didn't stand in applause for that. Do you have concerns he's going to paint the party socialist?
The House Democratic Caucus supports a well-regulated free market economy that is also anchored in a robust social safety net, including Social Security and Medicare. We, as House Democrats, support what I would term compassionate capitalism that is based on an emphasis of the well-being of working families, middle-class folks, senior citizens, the poor, the sick, and the afflicted. Donald Trump apparently supports crony capitalism, and Exhibit A is the reckless tax cut where 83% of the benefits went to the wealthiest 1% in the United States of America. We don't support crony capitalism. We do support compassionate capitalism that looks out for everyday Americans.
You know, I'd just like to add, one of the things that was really notable that it was missing was there was just the briefest mention of the infrastructure investment. And that is one of the ways that Democrats, and we hope the White House will join us, is looking at creating good jobs and increasing wages by investing in America again and investing in infrastructure. And for the president just to leave that out of his speech, not address that at all, except in the most glancing way, really stood out to me as an omission.
Heather?
Earlier, Chairman Schiff announced that Cohen's testimony is again postponed, quote, in the interest of the investigation. I think he's supposed to go to prison March 6th. I mean, do you guys, what's your read on that? Do you think he will end up testifying? And is it important that he does testify for House oversight or not?
Well, it's not clear to me that he will or he will not testify, I do think that House Democrats are compelled to make sure that all of the information, as appropriate, make it into the public domain so that the American people can decide for themselves, did the Russians attack our democracy with the aid and comfort of members of the Trump campaign? That's a legitimate question, and I think we all have a responsibility to our democratic republic to make sure that we get the answers. Part of that responsibility is going to be to protect the Mueller investigation. The other part of that responsibility as a separate and co-equal branch of government is to make sure that the information is aired in an objective and appropriate and non-sensationalized fashion to the American people.
This morning, Congresswoman Dingell announced that her husband, John Dingell, is going to be in city jail in health. I was curious if you have spoken with her, and what do you think John Dingell's legacy is on the House Representatives?
Well, Catherine will speak to that as well, but I think when we arrived into the United States Congress together as part of the class of 2012, John Dingell was one of those legendary members who's an institutionalist who's done great good for the people that he represented for decades in Michigan, and in his capacity as a dynamic chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Our thoughts and prayers continue to be with John Dingell and Debbie Dingell, as well as the Dingell family and all the people that have supported him throughout the years. And I think he will go down in history as one of the most impactful members of the United States Congress. And he's a great tweeter as well.
Yeah, I have spoken to Debbie and been in contact with her, and as Hakeem said, our thoughts and prayers are with her and with John. And one of the first meetings I had when I came into Congress 5 years ago was to meet with John Dingell, which was a little intimidating, but in a very John Dingell way, he welcomed me into his office and said, "You are as welcome as spring," which I always will remember. And really his message to me was always look at the wide Democratic caucus and what it takes to build a majority and find those issues where we can come together despite our different perspectives and where we are on the ideological spectrum. Remember that it's that commitment to American families and to equality that drives democratic values, and always look for that in your fellow Democrats and honor that. And those are words that I think I'll never forget. And I think we really saw that in display in the midterms, and that's very much a legacy of John Dingell.
Time for two more questions. We'll go to the back and then fourth row.
Democratic leadership continues to come under fire as troubles now. There's an allegation of sexual assault against the state's lieutenant governor, Mr. Justin Fairfax. So as Democrats, I'm asking you, should these allegations be considered serious? And in your opinion, does the accuser deserve due process?
Well, this accuser and any accuser deserves due process, an opportunity to be heard, as well as the opportunity to be treated with the dignity and respect through a process that will be put in place in order to figure out what happened. That said, with respect to the dynamics as it relates to whether the governor stays or goes, at this point, the Virginia congressional delegation appears to continue to be speaking in one voice, and I stand behind their position. There's an emerging bipartisan consensus that shutdowns are a reckless negotiating tactic and should never again be used when there is a legitimate dispute between different branches of government. Those disputes should be worked out by us trying to find common ground, not by shutting down the government or threatening a national emergency. With respect to legislation to end the practice of shutdowns, there are bills that have been either introduced or in the process of being discussed. We all believe that this should be done in a bipartisan way. and we're at a very preliminary stage of having those discussions and working out the particular legislative vehicle that we should employ. Thanks, everyone.